Under the high glass dome of the Knesset, the air was electric. Cameras lined the aisles, journalists whispered into their microphones, and lawmakers leaned forward in their seats as Donald Trump, once again at the center of global controversy, rose to speak. It was October 13th, 2025, a day already thick with political weight. The former US president, now back in office for a second term, had come to Israel not only as an ally, but as a showman, a figure whose words could upend headlines in seconds. And then he said it. "Hey, I have an idea," Trump declared, his voice echoing across the chamber. "Mr. President, why don't you give him a pardon? Give him a pardon. Come on." The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, chants of "Bibi, Bibi" filled the hall. The cameras caught Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's expression, half smile, half surprise. Beside him, President Isaac Herzog shifted slightly in his chair, his diplomatic composure barely concealing the tension. Trump grinned, leaning into the reaction. "By the way," he continued, "that was not in the speech, as you probably know, but I happen to like this gentleman right over here, and it just seems to make so much sense, you know. Whether we like it or not, this has been one of the greatest wartime presidents, and cigars and champagne, who the hell cares about that?" The laughter in the chamber was uneasy. What Trump had just done, live, on Israeli soil before an international audience, was not a minor aside. It was an unmistakable call for Israel's leadership to end years of legal proceedings against Netanyahu, whose corruption trials had divided the country for nearly a decade. For Netanyahu, it was a moment that blurred the line between politics and justice, between the courtroom and the global stage. Israel's longest-serving prime minister had spent years fighting 3 separate corruption cases, charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Prosecutors accused him of exchanging regulatory favors for lavish gifts and positive media coverage. Netanyahu denied it all, calling the accusations a witch hunt, a political coup, and an attempt to remove by legal means what could not be removed by elections. His supporters echoed those words, describing the proceedings as a judicial coup against the will of the people. But never before had an American president, sitting in office, called openly for a pardon. That is what made Trump's words so explosive. In Israel's charged political environment, where debates over judicial reform had already sparked mass protests earlier in the year, his remarks cut to the heart of a national divide. For Trump, it was vintage performance, bold, unscripted, and perfectly timed for maximum attention. The moment spread instantly across social media. Clips of him urging a pardon trended under hashtags like Trump in Jerusalem, and Bibi pardon supporters hailed it as a gesture of loyalty. Critics called it foreign interference in a domestic legal process. Outside the Knesset, reporters swarmed. The reactions were swift. In Tel Aviv, political commentator Dana Weiss told Channel 12, Trump did what Trump does best, blur lines, break norms, and test how far the political system will bend to his will. In Washington, State Department officials offered no official comment, but privately expressed surprise that the US president had chosen to wade into Israel's judiciary affairs so publicly. Meanwhile, Netanyahu's own camp sought to strike a careful balance. His spokesman issued a brief statement. The Prime Minister deeply appreciates President Trump's friendship and his long-standing commitment to the State of Israel. The Prime Minister continues to place his faith in Israel's independent judicial system. Yet the image of Netanyahu sitting silently as Trump called for his pardon was powerful and polarizing. In Jerusalem cafes, the conversation was the same everywhere. What did Trump mean by this? Was it a genuine plea or a political stunt? Could Herzog, as Israel's largely ceremonial president, even issue such a pardon? Legally, yes, but politically, it would be seismic. Israeli law allows the president to grant pardons, usually after sentencing. Netanyahu's trials were still ongoing. For Herzog to act now would mean overriding a process that had consumed the Israeli judiciary for years. And yet Trump's words resonated deeply with Netanyahu's base, a movement that had long accused prosecutors of bias and overreach. For them, the idea of a pardon symbolized closure, a symbolic end to what they viewed as persecution. As the day unfolded, the Knesset moment replayed endlessly on screens worldwide. Trump, the self-proclaimed dealmaker, had turned a diplomatic address into a courtroom drama. Observers noted how effortlessly he blended political theatre with populist appeal. He invoked wartime leadership, national loyalty, and the futility of moral outrage. Cigars and champagne, who the hell cares? a reference to the gifts that formed part of Netanyahu's charges. It was the kind of rhetorical flourish that blurred ethics into entertainment. In many ways, Trump's remarks were not about Netanyahu alone, they were about Trump himself, a leader who had faced his own indictments, investigations and legal battles, standing before a counterpart in similar straits. The subtext was unmistakable. Leaders who fight the system should be shielded, not punished. The message landed hard in both Jerusalem and Washington. Editorials across major newspapers dissected it. The Jerusalem Post wrote that Trump had turned the Knesset into a campaign rally. Haaretz called it an act of political intrusion masquerading as friendship. In the United States, reactions were divided along familiar lines. Supporters praised Trump's defense of Netanyahu as a stand against political persecution. Critics accused him of undermining the rule of law abroad, a reflection, they said, of his disregard for judicial independence at home. But beyond the noise, the symbolism was undeniable. Two leaders bound by history, controversy, and a shared narrative of defiance, standing once more at the intersection of politics and justice. As the sun set over Jerusalem, the Knesset's marble floors were nearly empty, but the echoes of that moment lingered, a single improvised line that had reignited a national debate. In the following days, Israeli commentators debated whether Trump's words would have any tangible impact. Legally, they would not, but politically, they changed everything. They reminded Israelis how intertwined their story remained with Washington's, and how easily one speech could tilt the balance of public opinion. Weeks later, as Netanyahu returned to court, the question hung in the air: could a foreign leader's public appeal affect the perception of justice at home? For Trump, perhaps, it didn't matter. He had once again claimed the spotlight, reshaping the narrative, commanding attention, and rewriting the boundaries of diplomacy with a few unscripted sentences. For Netanyahu, it was more complicated. Trump's words had revived his base, but also reignited scrutiny. His trials, once confined to legal briefs and courtrooms, were now front-page material again, framed not just as cases of corruption, but as questions of legitimacy, loyalty, and leadership. And for Israel, it was a moment that tested the resilience of its democratic institutions and its ability to separate politics from the rule of law. In that sense, October 13th, 2025 was not merely another day in the life of Israeli politics. It was a reminder that in the age of spectacle, the stage itself has become part of the story, and that in the theatre of power, every word carries consequence. From the marble halls of Jerusalem to the newsrooms of Washington, one phrase continued to echo long after the applause had faded: give him a pardon. A suggestion, a provocation, and perhaps, in Trump's mind, a headline that would once again make the world stop and listen.